Today I will be talking about how the brain integrates auditory and visual signals in communication. And of course, I'm going to focus mostly on gesture here, but I'll also cover some other visual signals, like signals that are coming from the face. And I know it's very late in the afternoon for you guys, so I thought I'll just start with my take-home message, just to make sure that you're awake. The take-home message that I wanted to give to you for today is that language is very much distributed in the brain. So it is not set in a separate static language network, but it is dynamic, it's emergent, and especially in these multimodal settings, such as when we encounter speech and gestures. And I hope to convince you of that by the end of the talk. So what I mean with that is that because of the multimodal character that language has, it cannot be constrained to a fixed language network, like the one that you see here and the one that you usually get in classic books on psycholinguistics or neurolinguistics. So they would say it's a very fixed, left lateralized network that's in charge of language. But I think if we consider these more multimodal contexts, we really need to consider a more distributed perspective. Now, perhaps that's also not such a wild thought, right? That there might be more regions at work than what some might consider as the core language network. Here, for example, you see this natural situation in which we communicate. So language can be challenging. There are multiple people present. There might be a lot of noise around you because people are talking. And of course, there's also visual streams coming from the face, the body, and also the hands. Now, on the other hand, language can also be full of disfluencies, especially when people are talking naturally. So you have different topics that intermerge. There's incomplete sentences. And language is very messy for that reason. But most of all, it's really multimodal, right? And especially used in face-to-face communication as well. And today I will argue that all of these different information streams, so from speech, visual signals, and contextual signals as well, are dynamically integrated by the brain, and that language emerges from this dynamic integration. Now, let's first look at this situation again. So you could imagine that in this natural situation in which we communicate, the person in the middle is perhaps talking to the other person, and he says, "Did you see those small glasses?" Now, this unimodal part of language, so the speech would be considered by most models and also theories about language as sort of, yeah, the fundamental architecture of language. But these visual signals make a difference, right? And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here because you all know this. Traditionally, these visual signals have often been considered outside of outside of language or outside of the linguistic domain. But especially if we look at models of the neurobiology of languages, I think it's very important to consider these visual signals because they can really shape how we process linguistic input. So in this example, we could really think, yeah, is he talking about glasses, as in the small glasses on someone's face, like spectacles? Or is he talking about a small glass? So really this combination of the two inputs sort of causes new meaning to emerge as well. So in face-to-face communication, as you know, language is multimodal. Now, in a bit more detail, the main question that we're working on in my research group is how do we, as listeners, also integrate all of these different auditory and visual inputs? So in this setting, again, that you see here, all of these inputs somehow need to be coupled together, right? And how these auditory and visual signals play together and how they jointly result in this coherent and integrated message that comes in through all of these different sensory channels, that is still an unresolved problem. And that is also the problem, or the main question that we're working on in my group and that we try to take into new directions because we really think this is a foundational problem for the field. Now, before we dive into details, of course, a question you could ask then is what we consider language to begin with, right? And I doubt that I will be giving you a finite answer to this today. But what we do know is, of course, that they all somehow involve the visual modality. So no known language only uses speech for its expression. Yet we rarely consider these multimodal signals in our models of the neurobiology of language. And I think it's that, yeah, they definitely need to be considered because it will change our perspective on how language is processed in the brain. Okay, now first, let me show you some examples of how these multimodal signals shape language processing. And I'm going to quickly go over some studies that we did on gestural enhancement of degraded speech in different contexts. So they're all somehow focused on noise, and this could be internal or external noise. Maybe someone could, yeah, thank you. Mute their mic. Yeah, and for that, I'm going to go back to this example because I drew these two circles around the face and also around the hands. And of course, these different visual channels can also convey different kinds of information, right? So we have visible speech that can say something about the sound or the form of a word. And on the other hand, of course, you're all familiar with iconic gestures that can say something about the meaning of a word. Now, if we look at traditional psycholinguistic studies, we often see that these two inputs are studied separately. So people show either just the face or the lips, or they show the torso, or they block the face or something to really focus on this one visual signal that they're interested in. But of course, in the case of gestures, they always occur in the context of a face, right? So it's important to consider this in a full multimodal context. So we did a long range of studies that all centered around the question, how do these visual signals then enhance speech comprehension in both clear and noisy speech? Now, to do that, we presented participants with videos. And in these videos, they would see a woman who would utter a Dutch action verb. Now, sometimes she would make a gesture, sometimes she would not, and sometimes we would show her lips, and sometimes we wouldn't. Now, the nice thing about this is that we could really see the benefit of the lip movements and also the benefit of the gestures, but also the benefit of these gestures on top of these lip movements, right? To really see under which conditions these visual signals would contribute most to comprehension. We tested this in clear speech. We tested this in different kinds of noise. I won't be going into all of the details of these studies because they had a lot of conditions and they were quite complicated. But I just want to show you the main results of these studies. So on the x-axis here, you can see the different conditions that we've used. 2-band noise vocoding means that there was really severe noise. And 6-band noise vocoding means that there was a moderate amount of noise. On the y-axis, you can see the enhancements that people got from the different visual articulators. In orange, you see double enhancement, which is the enhancement of both the visible speech and the gestures. You have gestural enhancement and visible speech enhancement. And what you should get from this graph here was that, especially under these moderate noise conditions, these gestures add most to comprehension in the context of visible speech. So iconic gestures really enhance your comprehension of speech under noisy conditions. So I will make sure to gesture a lot to compensate for all of your construction noise there in Hong Kong. Okay, so then we took that a bit further. So does everyone then benefit? So is it a beneficial thing for everyone? So for native speakers, for non-native speakers, etc. I'm just going to go over some of the main results because we did a lot of work in this domain. But if you're interested in any of these studies, feel free to type something in the chat or later on, and I can tell you more about it. So work led by Louise Schubels showed that older adults also benefit from iconic gestures during speech and noise comprehension, but that this benefit was sort of modulated by verbal working memory. We've seen these in more sentence contexts as well, these beneficial effects, but also using different kinds of noise. Recently, we've shown that autistic individuals benefit as much as non-autistic individuals, and this felt a bit counterintuitive because there were quite some studies that also showed that speech gesture integration in autism was slightly altered, but doesn't seem to be the case. Non-native listeners have shown to look more at gestures. We did this with eye tracking, but they benefit less. So they really need more cues, more phonological cues as well to couple the semantic information from the gesture to the speech signal. And interestingly, growing up in noise, so having this environment of noise that you're constantly exposed to, makes you benefit less than when you grow up in a quiet environment. So someone asked if I can share the links to these articles. So the articles are under the slide as well, but I'm also happy to share them later. And someone asked, are you possibly screen sharing now? I hope I am, and that you can see my slides, right? You can all see my slides, right? Yes. Okay. So then I don't know what that refers to. So please clarify what you mean with that. Okay, so this was sort of an introduction to the work that we've been doing in my group on a behavioral level. But we've been trying to take that into the brain as well to see how these different information streams are then coupled and how it sort of influences the weighting that you have the audiovisual information and how that affects how much you benefit from, for example, a gesture. And when we started out with this, by looking at how this is processed in the brain, there was mostly knowledge from fMRI. And fMRI is a method that allows you to see where in the brain something occurs. Now, if you think about it very simply, you could say that for speech-gesture integration, you would need regions that have something to do with vision, regions that have something to do with movement, with language, and putting all of these different inputs together, right? But the question, of course, is how these different brain regions that might be relevant for language processing engage in this process over time, because language is, of course, unfolding over time. A gesture is unfolding over time, and yeah, it could be that this involvement of these different areas differs also in different contexts. And to investigate this, we've made use of MEG, which is a method that has really good temporal resolution. And if we couple it with MRI scans, we can also see where in the brain certain things occur. And there we focused on neural oscillations, which can be described as rhythmic fluctuations of neuronal excitability. And these neural oscillations could be important to put all of this different information together. Now, we focused on different frequency bands, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on one. So alpha oscillations. And what do we know about alpha? Now, alpha is a sort of default state of the brain. And when a brain area needs to be recruited for a particular function, we can see that alpha power needs to be suppressed. And that is then also a signal of the fact that these areas are now actively involved in a certain task. Now, of course, areas that are not actively involved shouldn't change or should have increased alpha. So alpha can sort of act as a gating mechanism in that way. And this gating serves the allocation of neurocomputational resources and is also thought to modulate the feed-forward flow of information in the brain. So if we look at our example, we would only expect to see this suppression in areas that are relevant for multimodal language processing, which are here in color. Now, for this study, we presented participants with similar videos as the ones that I mentioned earlier already, this time with a gesture or no gesture, and with clear speech and moderately noise-vocoded speech. And we chose for moderate noise vocoding here because this was this level where these gestures added most to comprehension, right? So we would see maximal effect of this gestural enhancement in the brain. Now, the task for participants was quite easy. So they would watch and listen to these videos and then would have to identify which verb they observed. Okay, so I'm jumping straight to the results. What I've made here, just to make it a bit easier, is a timeline of these different videos. And the example that you see here is zipping. So that would be something like this, so zipping. After about 700 milliseconds, the speech would start in the video, and the gesture, so really the preparation of the gesture would start at about 120 milliseconds. The stroke of the gesture and the speech would be unfolding at the same time. And what I'm going to plot under this is what is going to happen in the brain. Now we're going to look at situations where gestures add most to speech comprehension, so in noise. Now here you can see a bint over 200 milliseconds, what is happening with these alpha oscillations. And blue means that these alpha oscillations are being suppressed. Now the orange, sort of pink shaded bar that you see there is the point where this effect becomes significant. And as you can see, this effect sort of goes from the right side of the brain to the left side of the brain and really involves a lot of different regions as well. We've source localized this as well to see if we can see any patterns there. We first see a more like right lateralized cluster, probably because of the graded speech, that moves to the hand area of the motor cortex, sort of showing that you simulate this gestural information to also aid lexical retrieval later. And later on, we see this more left lateralized network where probably this information is being unified together. Now, interestingly, we also see a very strong link between brain and behavior. So what we see is that when people show this alpha power suppression more, we also see that they benefit more from gesture. So the relationship between these two seems to be quite strong. Now, interestingly, Nijmegen, the city that I'm from, is at the German border. So this means that we have a lot of German students that come here to study psychology. And they all need to learn Dutch. And they have this crash course over summer where they are brought up to a high intermediate level. And we wanted to see if similar brain networks were involved for these German students as well after they learned Dutch. In general, we saw that the same network was being used for this, but we also saw some differences. So especially in the area that corresponds to visible speech in the motor region, this was less recruited by the non-native listeners, probably because they can get less information from the lips and couple that to the semantic information. And this also has an influence on how strongly areas related to meaning and unification were employed. So if you cannot glean this phonological information, you also cannot really couple this to the meaning and unify all of this information together in a similar way as the native listeners. Now, again, for the non-native listeners, we saw that the larger this alpha power suppression occurred, the larger the gestural benefit was. So again, we saw a very strong link between brain and behavior. Now, I started this talk by saying that I would be talking about how the brain couples all of these different information streams, right? And so far, I've given you some results that show what happens in the brain, but not really how this information is being coupled. To investigate this, we developed a novel technique called rapid invisible frequency tagging. And rapid invisible frequency tagging uses novel projector technology at a very high frequency to modulate the luminance of a certain stimulus. So here you see that at a very slow speed, so you see this dot flickering. But we can also do that at very high speeds by just singling out separate bits of the screen. And if we do that at very high frequencies, it will be invisible to the human eye. So anything above 60 Hertz, you will not be able to see. So you will not see it flickering like you see it now on the slides, but your brain will register it. Now, what do I mean with that? If we do this at, let's say, 68 Hertz, we will also see a 68 Hertz brain signal over visual regions in the brain. Likewise, we can do that with sound as well. So if we modulate the amplitude of, for example, the speech signal at, let's say, 61 Hertz, we can also see a 61 Hertz brain signal occurring over auditory regions in the brain. Now, what we found out is, and this is spoiling it a bit already, is that when these two information streams come together, we see a novel signal popping up. This is the intermodulation frequency, which is the interaction of the auditory and the visual stream. Now that works like this. So if these two signals multiply together, we will see a novel signal in the brain popping up at 7 Hertz and 129 Hertz as a result of this interaction. Now, the benefit of this technique, so abbreviated, it's RIFT, it's a lot easier than rapid invisible frequency tagging, is that it leaves these lower frequency oscillations, like these alpha oscillations that I talked about, it leaves them completely unperturbed and open for investigation. So you can sort of see how this gating mechanism that I talked about with alpha will link to this integration signal, right? So to really see how this different information is being routed through the brain and coupled. At the same time, the tagging is invisible, which results in very naturalistic paradigms and a lack of participant awareness. So we can sort of use this as a wiretap for perceptual processing. Now, when we started out with this, it of course sounds very exciting, but yeah, you first have to sort of show that it works, right? So that's what we did. We provided a proof of principle for this by using our tried and tested videos, this time with a matching gesture and a mismatching gesture, and degraded speech and clear speech. This time to yeah, sort of have this visual semantic factor that affected the integration, but also this more low-level factor by comparing clear speech and degraded speech to really see what would affect this integration signal most. Now, these example frequencies that I just chose while explaining this technique, those were exactly the frequencies that we used as well, but you can basically use any frequency above 60 hertz. Now, we did a similar task, so they watched the videos, had to identify the verb, and then they moved on to the next trial. Now, what did we find? Did it work? Well, it did. What we did was first some sanity checks. So if we would compute like a 68 hertz dummy signal that would reflect the flickering, and we looked at the 68 hertz signal in the brain and sort of computed the similarity between the two, we saw that the similarity was very high over visual regions in the brain, which is what you can see here in red. Now, interestingly, we can already, these were the top 20% values that we plotted, but if we plotted everything, you could already see that this sort of went towards these regions that we saw in this other study as well that were relevant for the integration, right? And we had these different conditions, so we compared them as well. And what we saw there was that this was strongest for the clear speech signal, which might feel a bit counterintuitive because you would think like, okay, when speech is degraded, they would benefit more from this gesture, right? But rift is sort of a measure of attention as well. And in clear speech, you can just keep your focus on the middle of the screen. But in degraded speech, you will look more at the face as well to get some more information there as well, which is also confirmed by our eye tracking results. Now, we also did a similar sanity check for the auditory signal, which again, we found strongest over right lateralized regions. This is because the speech was degraded. It was also present at left lateralized regions, but these are again the top 20% of the channels. And this was strongest for degraded speech. So you attend more to the speech signal when speech is degraded. So our sanity checks at least worked out. Now, then we thought, okay, this is going great. Let's look at this integration signal, right? So this intermodulation frequency that we hypothesized. And we already knew that we couldn't look at 129 hertz because it's outside of the range of frequencies that you can see with MEG. But we still had this 7 hertz signal that we could look at. So we took a similar approach again, and we computed this 7 hertz dummy signal that we wanted to compare to the 7 hertz brain signal as observed in these regions relevant for speech gesture integration. And when we looked at that, we found nothing. So we were a bit worried at that point, and we thought, how can this be? Because we made simulations of this, and we thought this had to work out, right? And then we started thinking that, of course, the integration of speech and gestures, or the time point that this integration, at which this integration occurs, will differ over time. And if we're going to compute coherence between two signals, then if it's not perfectly aligned, there will be no coherence whatsoever. So instead, we looked at power, and luckily, we then indeed saw these regions that are relevant for speech gesture integration popping up again. Interestingly, this was strongest for conditions with clear speech and a matching gesture, which we didn't expect beforehand. So we thought that this had to be degraded speech and a matching gesture because there the benefit is largest. But this showed us that the intermodulation frequency is an index of the ease of lower order interactions and not so much affected by semantics. A former postdoc in the group, Noor Seidel, then took this a bit further and investigated if RIFT can also be used to study attention allocation during multimodal language processing. So she used different frequencies on different sides of the screen to see if this affects the frequency tagged signal as well. And it did. So the more you indeed attended to a certain thing, the stronger you would see this frequency tagged signal popping up. And again, we saw these intermodulation frequencies as well. Now, currently we're looking into whether the strength of this intermodulation signal is also dependent on the informativeness of visual signals. So we collected a lot of data in more naturalistic context as well, where we scored the informativeness of lip movements and of gestural signals to see how this affects the integration. So is attention allocation and signal integration also altered by the informativeness of gestures and visible speech? And I had this great hope that I would have finished that by today, but I only have some preliminary results. So we replicated the rift work that we did before. So for clear speech, people attend more to the gesture, and for degraded speech, they attend more to the lips. And similarly, when the speech sound is more degraded, they also attend more to that. But yeah, we would have to see if this goes together with the informativeness scores as well. Now, again, we see strong intermodulation frequencies. So these are at the sum of the different frequencies of the different interactions between our input frequencies, right? And they differ for clear speech and degraded speech in strength, depending on which signals are being combined. So as a interim summary and my take-home part 2, I've shown you that these multimodal signals influence language processing, that brain oscillations support the engagement of these task-relevant brain areas, and that drift is a promising method to look at this neural interaction and propagation of auditory and visual information. Now, so far, this has been mostly people sitting at a computer, right? So not so much these natural contexts that I talked about at the start of this talk. So I also want to show you some results on what happens between brains as well. Now, the first question to ask then is why synchronization or neural synchronization or synchronization between people then would matter. And I've shown you a lot of results on what happens within a brain already. And previous results have sort of suggested that the synchronization of oscillatory activity may be necessary for the selection, the gating, and the integration of information within one brain, so what I've just shown to you. And at the same time, these sensory signals, because they unfold at different moments in time, may also change the cortical excitability of signals in another modality. So it might be that, for example, visible speech information sort of primes what you are going to hear. And perhaps that also works the same way in gesture, but we don't know that yet. Noor Seidel, the postdoc that I was talking about, tested this in our data as well. So she wanted to see if the synchronization between these auditory and visual regions in the brain could also predict integration. And indeed, in the case of a clear speech and a matching gesture, we saw that the synchronization, so the communication between these early sensory regions, is also stronger in conditions where this lower order interaction is easiest. Now let's move forward to what happens between brains then. And this is work by Sarah Massini, who just finished her PhD. So she just got her degree. And she reasoned that alignments between people, both on or on a neural level, might occur because of oscillatory synchronization between brains. And there has been quite a lot of work that looks at interbrain synchrony already, that has reported like these neural synchronization between people, and said like, oh, you really need to be on the same wavelength, sort of say, to make sure that communication is successful. But this has never been tested directly. So the question she asked in her PhD was, is this neural synchrony necessary and also beneficial for successful face-to-face communication? And in order to address this research question, we of course first need to ask ourselves which mechanisms then make communication successful. So what allows communication to proceed so that the interlocutors can also transfer this coherent message and understand each other, right? So for that, she decided to look at other-initiated repair. An other-initiated repair can be described as the ongoing course of the conversation is interrupted to attend to possible trouble in speaking, hearing, or understanding. So we sort of can take this as a signal of miscommunication. So a mechanism to build mutual understanding between conversational partners. And I have some examples here. So here, for example, Will says, I've got football later. And James says, yeah, and then looks down at his watch. And then Max asks for clarification. So he asks, are you playing? That's the trouble source, because James then asks her, as in, I don't understand you. Then Max is going to clarify and says, are you playing footy? And then they understand each other. And James says, yeah, I think so. So in this case, we can identify a trouble source, a repair initiation, a repair solution, and acceptance. So we have clear moments where people understand versus not understand each other. Now, this was one example of a repair, but they come in many different shapes and forms. So here I've plotted a few other examples as well. So it's not just not hearing someone, but it can also just be a bit more specific. And we decided to group all of these different things together. Now, what people did was they came to the lab and they talked to each other while they were wearing EEG, so that we could actually measure their brain activity in a live conversation. And we decided to do the tangram task with a lot of different tangrams that they would have to match up together. So they would have all of these different forms, and I'm going to show you an example in a bit, and they would have to end up with the same grid. And we didn't do it in a way where one was the director and the other was the matcher. We just said, solve this together and make sure you end up with the same grid. Because I'm a big lover of these noise manipulations, I thought, let's throw that into the mix as well, because you can imagine that if there's noise present, there might be even more misunderstandings, and this effect might be even stronger, right? Now, we did this with these little puppet-like figures, but we also had animal-like figures as well to keep it fun for the participants. Now, what we expected is that when people would have to describe these different figures, these repairs would occur. And what we expected was that synchrony between people would go down during a repair initiation. So a moment where they would not understand each other. And then it would go up when they would understand each other again. So this would be completely in line with all of these studies that said that neural synchrony is very important for successful communication, right? So it was a very straightforward hypothesis, and we just thought, let's look at the frequencies that have been reported so far in the literature, which were in alpha and beta. And I'm going to show you an example of what that looked like with subtitles as well. And it looks something like this.
Op D1 heb je, ja,
Oh, sorry.
op D1 heb je, ja, ik weet niet hoe ik het moet omschrijven, een soort insect. Dus 2 driehoeken naast elkaar. Daaronder een lichaam en dan onder het lichaam een driehoek. Een soort insect. Ja, ik denk dat je deze bedoelt. Ja, dus hij heeft hij wijst naar links. Met zijn kop. Of ja, hij heeft een soort van, ja, ik weet niet of het een kop is. Ik denk dat ik die op C1 heb dan misschien. Oké, ik heb op C1 heb ik een vogel die wel met zijn kop naar boven zijn vleugels uitkomt. Ja, dat heb ik ook en die kijkt dan naar links. Oké, dan zit hij goed. Een soort insect met 2 driehoeken. Een soort van slang onder zijn lichaam. Ik weet niet of het een slang is, maar hij heeft zeg maar er zijn 2 driehoeken naast elkaar. Zeg maar op dezelfde hoogte. En daaronder zit dan het lichaam. Oké, ik heb wel, en dan daarboven een soort van hoofd. En dan daaronder een driehoekje nog? Een soort van totempaal vind ik dat meer. Nee, want hij is zeg maar echt meer horizontaal. Het ziet er een beetje uit. Oké, het kan ook een vogel zijn die met een prooi vliegt, maar dat weet ik niet zo goed. Oké, ik zie echt even niet wat je bedoelt. Ah, ja, maar die heb ik op B3 heb ik die. Oké, wacht, op B3 heb ik... Oh, maar dat is meer, dat heb ik als totempaal. Daar heb ik de totempaal. Oké, ik heb nou de totempaal heb ik op B3. En die van nu doe ik dan op D1. Ja.
Yeah, so as you can see, there were many moments where they did not understand each other. And they made a lot of gestures as well, which was very interesting for us as well. So in a follow-up project, we want to see whether these gestures also affect synchrony in a way, but we didn't get to that yet. because we first looked at the results to see if we can find these changes in synchrony, right? So if they don't understand each other versus they understand each other. So we looked at these alpha and beta frequencies in clear speech and in noise. And we expected to see great differences, but when we looked at the results, we found absolutely nothing. So there were no differences between the initiations and the solutions, or the initiations and the acceptance, or the clear speech and the noise. We have found absolutely nothing. So it seems to be that this neural synchrony is not so much related to successful communication, or that it's even necessary. We've also tested this with Bayesian methods. Believe me, we tried a lot, but didn't find anything there. So we're going to see if this is just a matter of looking at wrong bits of the data, so to say, or looking at the data in another way, or if this is just really not a thing. But feel free to ask me questions about this later as well. Now, it wasn't all terrible, so we've also looked at whether these gestures then somehow increase your attention to the speech. So do these gestures increase neural tracking of the speech signal in clear and noise? And there we found some really interesting results. So for both in clear speech and in noise, we saw that the brain tracks the speech signal more strongly when a gesture is present as compared to a movement that is kinematically similar. And with a gesture here, I mean meaningful gestures, so iconic gestures, as compared to movements that were just had a similar kinematic profile. So luckily, there were some results that worked out for the thesis. And we've had some other results on interbrain synchrony as well. This was a collaboration with Judith Holler, where we compared face-to-face versus face-to-face with an occluder in between and back-to-back to sort of see whether spatial orientation in itself is sort of enough to render the brain in a more in a state where it's optimized for communication. And there we did see some differences. So we saw stronger synchronization when people were sitting face to face as compared to back to back or face to face and an occluder in between. So both spatial orientation and the visibility of visible signals are important here. So we really believe that the semantic and the pragmatic information that is being conveyed by visual communicative signals might sort of facilitate joint attention towards coordinating these predictive processes that make language so successful. Okay, I'm just going to check how much time I still have. Renia, how much do I still have? Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Depends whether you want questions or not. We
Okay, well, of course, I would like some questions. I think I would have about like 5 minutes left. Is that, would that work? Okay. Because I sort of wanted to wrap this up as well in a way where I want to argue for this more multimodal model of language in the brain. So I started out with saying that language is an emergent property of dynamic integration, not reducible to these individual brain areas. And that's because the brain needs to respond to multimodal sensory information, contextual cues, and also prior knowledge. So to partition the brain into something with sort of a fixed language network, I think would be overlooking this fluidity, right? So this context dependency and the dynamic character of neural processes. So perhaps we should no longer ask what a language network is, but we should be searching for these universal processing capacities that allow the brain to couple these different neural subroutines and networks together. So for example, in a situation like speech-gesture integration, we have multiple relevant neural networks that need to communicate with each other to put together these different bits that make up language in daily life. And it needs to be a non-static network to adapt to the demands of language processing as well, with regions also then taking on different roles depending on the context and the specific requirements of a linguistic task. So this framework, which we provisionally called Dynamic Integration and Emergence, we are looking for a better name because its abbreviation is DIE, and that's a bit aggressive, of course. would state that language emerges from this interaction and that these networks are constantly in communication to reconfigure, to also make sure that you can take this context into account. So language should be considered as widely distributed in a brain, not a discrete unit, but more of this dynamic interconnected network that facilitates this integration. And the interaction between these different networks then is characterized by flexibility and also plasticity to enable the brain to adapt to these different contexts. Now, I'm going to skip a couple of slides and say, where do we then go from here? Now, we need to study language in these more ecologically valid settings, and especially in the case of research on the cognitive neuroscience of language. Yeah, language as construed for brain research doesn't seem to be how we use and comprehend language in daily life. So what we want to do now is to move from observing to active participation. So are all of these laboratory results that we've had, are they a valid model for real-world communication? And then, of course, natural data can be used to form hypotheses that are tested in the lab or in a virtual avatar. So I sort of see this as a continuous loop. Now, the outstanding questions that then still occur are how do we put all of these different signals then together? So how do we integrate these different signals that have different temporal profiles that occur at different moments in time? And how do these oscillatory brain rhythms also handle this? How does multimodal behavior relate to neural synchrony, both within a brain but also between brains? Individual differences, so can differences in neural patterns also explain behavior? And how is natural language then organized in the brain? And I wanted to do some final advertising before I stop speaking. So I will be looking for a PhD as part of my new ERC project. So it will be mostly on what I just presented, so multi-time scale oscillatory dynamics. And we're looking for someone that could start somewhere in 2026, but before September. So if you know someone or you are that someone, please email me because the vacancy will be out, I hope, next week. And thank you very much. And these are the people that did most of the work.